The woman on the other side of the glass said, "You are making a list." Commander Nea Soren did not look up from her console. She kept her fingers moving across the interface, pulling records one at a time from the decrypted archive that her team had been sifting for the past 11 hours. Names, transport manifests, holding facility designations, population transfer orders stamped with the interlocking circle's seal of the Kalori Trade Authority. Each entry was a line in a document that no one outside Terran naval intelligence had ever been meant to read, and Soren was reading every one of them with the same meticulous patience she had brought to this work for the past 11 years. "I am making a list," she confirmed. The woman on the other side of the glass was Valith So, special envoy of the Kalori Trade Authority, and she had been escorted to this observation chamber 40 minutes ago by 2 Marine sentries who had not spoken a single word to her since. She was tall, ash-gray, with the elongated skull structure and recessed ear canals characteristic of Kalori aristocracy. Her robes were diplomatic white, the color of formal neutrality in Kalori culture, but the hem was stained with engine lubricant from the shuttle that had brought her here under armed escort from the orbital station, where her credentials had been revoked 6 hours ago. She sat in the molded chair on her side of the glass, with the posture of someone who still believed the rules applied. "A list of what?" Valith asked. Soren tapped a sequence on her console. A holographic display unfolded above the desk, a rotating 3-dimensional map of the Tessari cluster, 87 star systems marked in amber, 17 of them pulsing in deep red. The red ones were the ones that mattered. The red ones were the ones where people had been burned. "Names," she said, "of the 14,612 Terran colonists who were processed through your authority's labor redistribution program between 2307 and 2311. Specifically, I am compiling the names we can verify against the remains we have recovered from your facilities. So far, my team has matched 4,209. The silence that followed had a quality to it. The particular texture of silence that occurs when someone realizes the conversation they thought they were having is not the conversation that is actually taking place. Valith's hands were folded in her lap. They did not move. Her face remained composed, but Soren had spent 19 years reading alien body language for Terran naval intelligence, and she saw the faint contraction of the tendons along the envoy's neck, the Kalori equivalent of a human stomach dropping. She saw the micro-adjustment in the envoy's seated posture, a fractional shift of weight backward, an unconscious attempt to increase distance from the information. Soren noted it, filed it, kept her voice level. "Those colonists," Valith said carefully, "were relocated under the terms of the Tessari Administrative Compact. The Trade Authority's records show voluntary migration to designated settlement worlds within the cluster. Their status has been documented and certified by the Galactic Commerce Tribunal." Soren pulled a data wafer from the stack beside her console and held it up to the light. It was small, 2 centimeters square, translucent blue, stamped with the authority's interlocking circle seal. "This is one of yours. Recovered from a facility on Tessari 3 weeks ago by a Terran recovery team operating under sealed orders. The facility was not a settlement envoy. It was a processing center. This wafer contains intake records for 1,407 Terran colonists, men, women, and children from the Meridian colony on Tessari 3, which your authority reported as voluntarily depopulated in 2309. She set the wafer down on the desk with a small, precise click. The intake records include biometric scans, labor capacity assessments, and what your administrative language calls utility classifications. The classifications sort the colonists into 3 categories. Category 1, fit for labor extraction. Category 2, fit for biological material harvesting. Category 3, unfit for either purpose. She paused for exactly 1 second. The records show that Category 3, 814 people, most of them children under 6 and adults over 60, were processed within the first 72 hours of intake. Soren's voice had not changed. It maintained the same flat, measured cadence it had held from the beginning. This was something she had practiced over many years, not the calm, which was genuine, but the steadiness of delivery. The information had to land clean. Emotion would give the envoy something to react against, something to deflect. A raised voice could be dismissed as human emotionalism, the primitive response of a species that had not yet learned to separate feeling from policy. Cold data could not be dismissed. Processed, Valeth repeated. That word has administrative meaning within our institutional framework. It refers to the completion of intake procedures and the reassignment of individuals to appropriate residential categories. It refers to killing, Soren said. We recovered the remains. The facility on Tessari 9 had a thermal reclamation chamber in its sublevel, industrial scale, designed to handle organic material at volumes exceeding 200 kilograms per cycle. The chamber's usage logs correspond precisely to the dates on which Category 3 individuals were removed from the intake rolls. The mineral residue in the chamber, specifically the calcium phosphate compound ratios, matches the bone density signatures of the deceased colonists within a 98% confidence interval. Your authority did not relocate 14,000 people, envoy. It worked the useful ones to death and burned the rest. This was the frame, not the glass partition between them, though that was there too, reinforced polymer, triple-sealed, with acoustic dampeners that Soren had ordered disabled so that every word carried unfiltered. The frame was the 11-year investigation that had brought her to this room, on this station, in this hour. And to understand the frame, to understand why 138 Terran warships were currently moving through a transit corridor 17 light hours away, you had to go back to where it started. A Tuesday afternoon. A cubicle at the Terran Foreign Affairs Monitoring Division. A junior intelligence analyst named Nea Soren, age 27, finding a number that did not add up. The Tessari cluster was a contested administrative zone, 87 star systems that the Galactic Commerce Tribunal had designated as a joint development region shared between the Kalori Trade Authority and several minor species, with Terran colonial enclaves permitted under a trade and settlement compact signed in 2294. The arrangement was supposed to be mutual. The Kalori provided the infrastructure and transit rights. The Terran colonists provided labor, technical expertise, and trade volume. On paper, a model of interspecies cooperation. In practice, a remote cluster where the Kalori held effective administrative control, and the Terran colonies operated under their jurisdiction with limited independent communications. The anomaly was small. A routine population census filed by the Kalori Administrative Office for Tessari 3 listed the colony's Terran population at 11,000. The colony's own internal communications, intercepted as a matter of standard monitoring procedure by Soren's division, reference population figures 3,000 higher. The discrepancy was trivial enough to be a filing error, the kind of thing that happened regularly in multi-species administrative zones where census methodologies did not align. Soren flagged it, filed a query with the monitoring division's cross-reference database, and moved on to the next file in her queue. 3 months later, the Meridian colony on Tessari 3 stopped transmitting altogether. No distress signal, no gradual signal degradation, just silence from one day to the next. The Kalori Administrative Office reported that the colonists had accepted a voluntary relocation offer to interior settlement worlds with better climate, better infrastructure, a generous resettlement package. Earth's diplomatic office accepted the explanation. The query Soren had filed came back marked resolved, administrative variance within normal parameters. The file was closed. Soren did not close her copy. She had learned early in her career, and had verified the lesson every year since, that numbers do not lie the way people do. People lie with intent and misdirection. Numbers lie by absence, by the gap between what should be there and what is not. 3,000 people missing from a census was not a filing error. It was a measurement. The Kalori had been testing whether anyone would notice the difference between their reported figures and the colony's actual population. The test was a proof of concept. If no one noticed 3,000 missing, no one would notice 14,000. No one had noticed, so they had continued. Over the next 3 years, Soren tracked the disappearances from her desk at the monitoring division, quietly on her own time, without authorization and without support. Tessari 3 was the beginning. Then Tessari 7, a mining enclave of 2,000 that went silent in 2308 and was reported as evacuated due to atmospheric contamination. Then Tessari 11, a research station of 600. Then Tessari 14, an agricultural settlement of 3,000. Then Tessari 22, a transit hub of 1,500. One by one, the Terran colonial enclaves in the cluster went dark, and one by one, the Kalori Administrative Office filed reports explaining the silence. Voluntary relocation, economic migration, environmental hazard evacuation, administrative consolidation, medical quarantine. The explanations were always different, always plausible, and always lies. Soren knew they were lies because the numbers never reconciled. Every time a colony was reported as relocated, the receiving settlement worlds showed no corresponding population increase. The relocated colonists simply vanished from every database. 14,000 people do not relocate to better worlds without leaving a trace in any census, any housing record, any medical registration, any employment log. They vanish only when they have been taken somewhere that does not report to any external authority. By 2313, every Terran colonial enclave in the Tessari cluster had been emptied. 14,612 Terran citizens, men, women, children, engineers, farmers, linguists, medical workers, teachers, communications technicians, agricultural specialists, a 78-year-old xenobotanist, a 3-year-old girl, had disappeared from the administrative record. Earth's diplomatic corps had accepted every explanation without follow-up. The Galactic Commerce Tribunal had certified the relocations as lawful. The files were closed across every relevant institution. Soren spent the next 7 years building the case that would reopen them. She did it without institutional support for the first 4 years. She transferred from the monitoring division to a signals intelligence posting on Relay Station Kestrel, a move that her superiors interpreted as a routine career step, and that Soren had engineered specifically, because the posting gave her access to Kalori encrypted administrative traffic without requiring interdepartmental authorization. She taught herself to decode their filing systems, not the military encryption, which was sophisticated and compartmentalized, but the bureaucratic record-keeping, which was exhaustive and therefore vulnerable. The Kalori documented everything, every transfer order, every intake form, every utility classification, every thermal reclamation cycle. They documented it because their administrative culture demanded complete documentation of all institutional processes, and because they had never, in the entire history of the trade authority, encountered a situation where someone outside their system would read the documents with hostile intent. Soren read them with hostile intent. Night after night, in the small quarters assigned to her at Relay Station Kestrel, she sat at a personal terminal and worked through the Kalori administrative files with the systematic focus of someone dismantling an engine bolt by bolt. She developed her own cross-referencing methodology, a system for matching dates in one administrative category to events in another, tracking the paper trail that connected a colony's last census filing to the intake records at a processing facility hundreds of light-years away. She learned the names of the Kalori administrative officers who signed the transfer orders, and she tracked their careers through the authority's personnel files, watching them receive promotions and commendations for efficient management of what the institutional language called resource integration programs. One officer, a mid-level administrator named Viken Dreth, had received a Distinguished Service Citation in 2311 for what the citation described as exceptional throughput optimization at the Tessari 9 facility. Soren had decoded the throughput figures. They corresponded to the period when the facility had processed its highest volume of Category 3 eliminations. She built a map, not a physical map but a documentary one, a web of cross-referenced administrative records, hundreds of thousands of individual entries that traced the path of each Terran colonist from their last known location in the colonial enclaves to the intake facility where they had been sorted, classified, and either assigned to labor extraction or burned. The map took 4 years to construct. It required decrypting over 200,000 individual Kalori administrative files. Each one was a small, dry record of organized atrocity written in the procedural language of commerce and logistics, the same language used to track cargo shipments and equipment depreciation. In 2317, she brought the completed map to Rear Admiral Petros Kane, director of the Terran Intelligence Directorate's Special Investigations Division. Kane was 61, a career intelligence officer with 37 years of service who had seen enough classified material to understand that the universe contained things that diplomatic protests could not repair. He read Soren's report in complete silence, from the first page to the last. It took him 4 hours. When he finished, he set down the file, looked at her across his desk with an expression she had never seen on a senior officer's face before, and asked 3 words. "How many facilities?" 17 confirmed, she had answered. "Across 17 systems in the cluster. The largest is on Tessari 9, capacity approximately 3,000 per year. The smallest is on Tessari 31. The total thermal reclamation capacity of the combined facilities is sufficient to process roughly 12,000 individuals per standard year." Kane had stared at her for a long time. His hands were flat on the desk. She could see him processing it, the same way she had processed it 4 years earlier when the map had finally resolved from scattered data points into a coherent picture of industrialized killing. There was a threshold, she had learned, past which the scale of an atrocity ceases to produce proportional horror and instead produces a cold, mechanical resolve. She had crossed that threshold at file number 87,000, when she had decoded a thermal reclamation maintenance log that discussed efficiency improvements to the combustion chamber's intake conveyor system with the same technical language a factory engineer might use to optimize a production line. Kane crossed it somewhere in the middle of her report, and she saw it happen in his eyes. The moment when the information stopped being something to react to and became something to act on. He picked up his secure terminal and placed a single call, directly to the office of the fleet commander. Within 48 hours, Soren's investigation had been reclassified at the highest security level. Her team expanded from 1 analyst to 64. And a recovery operation designated Operation Quiet Ledger had been authorized under sealed orders with no expiration date, no diplomatic review requirement, and no budgetary ceiling. The day Kane made that call, Soren had sat in the corridor outside his office for 20 minutes, alone, staring at the opposite wall, not processing, not celebrating, running the operational mathematics. 64 analysts meant she could parallelize the decryption work. Sealed orders meant no diplomatic leaks. No expiration date meant she could work the timeline properly instead of rushing to meet a political deadline. And a fleet authorization meant that when the evidence was complete, the answer would be proportional to the crime and not to the comfort level of a diplomatic committee. She had gone back to her desk and started building the operational architecture that same afternoon. That had been 3 years ago. In those 3 years, Valeth Soren's expanded team had accomplished the following. They had mapped every facility, Not 17, as her original survey had identified, 23. 6 additional processing centers had been constructed in the years since her initial map, which meant the Kalori had expanded the program beyond Terran populations to include detainees from 3 other minor species in the cluster. The Tessari labor program was not only larger than her original estimate, it was still growing. They had infiltrated 6 of the 23 facilities using deep-cover operatives posing as Kalori administrative inspectors, internal auditors sent by the authority's own compliance division. The covers had held because Soren had designed them using the authority's own credentialing protocols, which she had decoded 4 years earlier during her solo work at Relay Station Kestrel. The operatives had recovered data wafers, biological samples, and in 3 facilities, living survivors. 47 Terran colonists, out of 14,612, had been found alive. Most were Category 1 laborers in advanced stages of physical deterioration, their bodies consumed by years of mineral extraction and heavy construction in environments that the Kalori considered too hazardous for their own workers. 7 of the 47 were children who had survived the initial culling only because they had been reclassified from Category 3 to Category 1 when they reached working age. The oldest survivor was 59. She had been in Category 1 labor for 12 years. Her hands were permanently deformed from repetitive mineral sorting, her fingers curled into fixed positions that she could no longer straighten. She had told Soren during her debriefing that she had stopped counting the years after the 5th one. Time, she said, had become a thing measured in work shifts and sleep intervals, not days or months. She did not know the current year until Soren told her. They had built the evidentiary archive, every recovered data wafer, every intake record, every thermal reclamation usage log, every bone calcium match from the recovery team's biological sampling, every testimony from the 47 survivors, recorded over weeks of careful, patient debriefing sessions conducted by Soren's analysts with trauma-informed protocols. The archive was comprehensive, irrefutable, and devastating. 147 terabytes. It documented a systematic program of forced labor, biological exploitation, and mass killing conducted over 15 years by a recognized interstellar trade authority operating under the protection of a galactic commerce treaty that was still in force. And they had built the fleet. This was the part that Valith So did not yet know about. This was the part that was right now assembling in the deep transit corridor 17 light towers from this station, under the command of Vice Admiral Curran Oduya, who had been given a set of instructions that Soren had written herself, and that Rear Admiral Kane had approved without altering a word. Secure all 23 facilities simultaneously, prevent the destruction of evidence, detain all Kalori administrative and security personnel present at each site, and ensure that not one additional Terran or non-Terran detainee was harmed in the process. The fleet designation was Task Force Ledger, 138 warships, 4 heavy assault carriers configured for orbital insertion, 22 electronic warfare platforms designed to suppress communications across the entire cluster simultaneously, 12 fast insertion marine transports carrying 9,000 ground troops who had spent the past 14 months training specifically for coordinated facility seizure operations across multiple simultaneous targets. The logistics chain alone involved 37 supply vessels positioned at pre-stage depot points along 7 transit corridors. The force was, by any reasonable military standard, grotesquely disproportionate to the objective. The Kalori Trade Authority maintained a security fleet of approximately 40 armed patrol vessels, fast and lightly armed, designed for customs enforcement and piracy deterrence, not naval combat. Task Force Ledger could have accomplished the seizure mission with 30 ships and 2,000 Marines. Soren had requested 138 ships and 9,000 Marines. The disproportion was the point. She had argued for it in the planning sessions, sitting across the table from Oduya and Kane and the 7 other senior officers on the operations command staff, and she had made the argument not in emotional terms but in strategic ones. The Kalori had operated their program for 15 years under the assumption that no one was paying attention, that the bureaucratic machinery of interstellar commerce would keep the disappearances invisible, that 14,000 dead colonists in a remote cluster would never generate enough political or military attention to produce consequences. The size of the fleet was Earth's answer to that assumption, not a proportional response, not a measured, diplomatically calibrated intervention. An answer so overwhelming in scale that it could not be misread, could not be filed away as an aberration, could not be negotiated down in a committee room. 138 warships for a trade authority with 40 patrol boats. The message was the ratio. In the 14 months since Task Force Ledger had been authorized, Soren had attended every planning session, every logistics briefing, every wargame simulation. She had briefed the Marine commanders on the layout of each facility, drawn from the intelligence her undercover operatives had gathered. She had mapped the ventilation systems, the security checkpoint positions, the locations of the thermal reclamation chambers that would need to be preserved as crime scenes. She had identified which facilities held living detainees, and which were now operating exclusively on non-Terran populations, so that the breach teams could prioritize the sites where lives were still at stake. She had also designed the Information Operations Plan, the automated evidentiary release system that would transmit the full archive to every diplomatic mission and media outlet in the galaxy at a precise, pre-scheduled time. The legal brief that would accompany the warrants, drafted in 17 languages with jurisdiction-specific annotations. The survivor testimony packages, edited for clarity but unaltered in content, that would be distributed to the Interspecies Rights Council's judges within hours of the operation's commencement. Every piece of it was documented, every contingency planned for, every decision logged and cross-referenced. Soren had learned this from the Kalori themselves. If you want a system to work perfectly, you document it perfectly. The difference was that her documentation served justice instead of concealing atrocity. Soren looked at the envoy through the glass. "Your authority's current diplomatic position," she said, "is that the Tessari labor redistribution program was a lawful administrative function conducted under the terms of the Tessari Administrative Compact. You have filed protests with the Galactic Commerce Tribunal. You have invoked sovereign administrative privilege under Article 17. You have requested formal mediation through the Interspecies Arbitration Council." She turned the console toward the glass so that Valith could see the display. The holographic list scrolled slowly, names in blue text against a dark field, each one linked by data threads to a recovery site, a biological confirmation, a cause of death. This is the list. 4,209 names confirmed so far. Each name is linked to a recovery site, a biological match, and a verified cause of death where the records permit verification. The youngest confirmed name is a Sham Morn, age 3, Tessari 3, Category 3, Thermal Reclamation 2309. The oldest is Dr. Emeric Zhao, age 78, Tessari 11, Category 3, Thermal Reclamation 2310. Dr. Zhao was a xenobotanist. He had published 41 peer-reviewed papers on adaptive plant biochemistry. He was studying the native moss analog on Tessari 11 when your authority's intake teams arrived at his research station. She paused, not for effect, because the next part mattered and she wanted the envoy to hear every syllable without distraction. "The list will be complete within 72 hours. When it is complete, it will be transmitted simultaneously to the Galactic Commerce Tribunal, the Interspecies Rights Council, every accredited diplomatic mission in the recognized galaxy, and every Terran media outlet. The full evidentiary archive, all 147 terabytes, will be released in its entirety. Nothing redacted, nothing summarized, nothing filtered through diplomatic intermediaries. The raw files, in their original Kalori administrative format, with certified translations in 17 languages. Valith's composure held. Barely. The tendons along her neck were rigid, and her folded hands had shifted, the left gripping the right wrist in the Kalori self-restraint posture that Soren recognized as the equivalent of a human digging fingernails into their own palm. The envoy's breathing had changed too, shallower and more rapid, though her face maintained its diplomatic mask. "And the fleet?" the envoy asked. Her voice was controlled, but the register had dropped half a tone, which in Kalori vocal patterns indicated suppressed alarm. "Task Force Ledger departed its staging area 4 hours ago," Soren said. 138 warships under Vice Admiral Oduya. They will arrive at the first facility in approximately 13 hours. The operation will proceed simultaneously across all 23 sites. Your security fleet has been tracked and plotted continuously for the past 8 months. We know the current position, heading, and patrol schedule of every armed vessel your authority operates. Each vessel will be given one opportunity to stand down upon contact. Any vessel that does not comply within 15 minutes will be disabled, not destroyed. Disabled. We are not coming to kill your patrol crew's envoy. We are coming to seize the facilities, secure every remaining detainee, and arrest every Kalori official whose name appears in the administrative chain of command for the labor redistribution program. She reached beside her console and lifted a second data wafer, this one stamped with the Terran Naval Intelligence seal, its surface flat matte gray. This wafer contains the arrest warrants, 312 individual warrants, issued under Terran sovereign authority and countersigned by the Interspecies Rights Council's Emergency Tribunal, which convened in closed session 9 days ago after reviewing the evidentiary summary I submitted. The warrants name every facility commandant, every intake processing officer, every thermal reclamation technician, every transport coordinator who moved people between facilities, and every member of the Trade Authority's Administrative Council who authorized, funded, supervised, or facilitated any component of the program at any level. She set the gray wafer down beside the blue one. They sat side by side on the desk, 2 small squares of compressed data, one documenting the crime, one authorizing the answer. The highest-ranking name on the warrant list is Administrative Premier Counselor Drevin Talos, who chairs your trade authority's governing body, and who personally signed the executive authorization for the Tessari labor program's expansion in 2312. Counselor Talos is currently aboard the authority's administrative station in orbit above Kalar Prime. Vice Admiral Oduya has been given specific instructions regarding the counselor's detention. Valith stared through the glass. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The station's environmental systems hummed. Somewhere beyond the hull, in the black between stars, 138 warships were moving through a transit corridor, running dark, their communications locked to tight beam protocols that even the Kalori's most advanced intercept stations could not detect. Soren knew this because she had designed the communication security protocols herself, sitting across a planning table from Vice Admiral Oduya 8 months ago, and explaining precisely how the Kalori intercept network operated, what frequencies it monitored, where the processing gaps were, and exactly how to move a fleet of 138 warships through Kalori-monitored space without triggering a single alert. She had spent 11 years building this moment, not this particular conversation, which was diplomatic procedure. The moment she had built was the one unfolding right now across every component of Operation Quiet Ledger simultaneously. The fleet in transit, the 64 analysts working on the deck below, the evidence vaults sealed and cataloged, the 47 survivors being cared for in the medical ward, the automated evidentiary release system armed and counting down. It was all one mechanism, designed to function as a single integrated system, and every component was running exactly as she had specified. "You cannot do this," Valeth said. The words came out flat, not a protest. A calculation spoken aloud, the envoy's mind running the implications faster than her training could package them into proper objections. "The fleet is already in transit," Soren said. "The warrants are already issued. The evidentiary release is scheduled and automated. The only variable remaining is whether your authority cooperates or resists. Cooperation means the security fleet stands down, the facilities are transferred intact, every detainee is evacuated safely, and the arrested officials face trial before the Interspecies Rights Council with full legal representation. Resistance means the security fleet is disabled by force. The facilities are breached by Marine assault teams. The detainees are still evacuated. The officials are still arrested. And the only material difference is that your authority also loses its entire security fleet and whatever remains of its diplomatic credibility." She tilted her head slightly, a small, deliberate gesture she had refined over years of interrogation work, because it communicated attentiveness without concession. "I have studied your authority's institutional decision-making patterns for 11 years, Envoy. Your leadership calculates cost and benefit with admirable precision when they believe the variables are real. I am presenting them with real variables. I am confident they will calculate correctly." Valeth was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to a register that Soren had never heard in any Kalori diplomatic communication across 19 years of monitoring their species. It was raw, unscripted, stripped of every layer of institutional polish. "You have been watching us for 11 years. "Longer," Soren said. "I found the first discrepancy 12 years ago, a population census on Tessari 3 that did not match the colony's own internal communications by 3,000 people. Your authority had been testing whether anyone would notice the gap between their filings and reality. I noticed. One analyst with a census discrepancy and a great deal of patience," Soren confirmed. "That is how this started. One number that did not add up, then another, then a pattern, then a map, then a case, then a fleet. Your authority built its program on the assumption that bureaucratic machinery would keep it hidden. I used the same bureaucratic machinery to dismantle it. Every data wafer I hold was filed by your own officers in your own systems, using your own protocols. You documented your own atrocity with meticulous care. I simply read the documents." There was a quality to this moment that Soren recognized, a cold, settled clarity she had experienced only a handful of times in her career. It was not satisfaction. Satisfaction would imply that the outcome served something personal, fed some hunger that needed feeding. This was not that. This was the sensation of a mechanism completing the function it had been designed to perform. 11 years of work, over 200,000 decrypted files, 64 analysts working in coordinated shifts, 47 survivors recovered from facilities that should never have existed, 4,209 names matched to remains, 312 arrest warrants, 138 warships. All of it a single machine that she had conceived, designed, assembled component by component over more than a decade, and that was now running precisely as intended. She thought of a Chamorno, age 3, thermal reclamation, 72 hours after intake. She thought of Dr. Emerick Zhao, age 78, 41 papers, moss on an alien world. She thought of the 47 survivors on the deck below this room. Quiet, hollowed people who spoke in flat voices about things that no administrative language could contain. People who had been classified by category and worked until their bodies failed, and who had survived only because the supply of expendable labor had outpaced the demand at their particular facility in their particular year. She had promised them, not in formal language, not in an official capacity. She had sat across from them in the debriefing room, one at a time, and she had told each of them the same thing. The list would be complete. Every name would be recovered and matched. The people who had done this would answer for it, not in a diplomatic hearing, not in a trade arbitration session, not in the polite institutional fictions of interstellar commerce, but in a tribunal, with the evidence displayed, with every name read aloud, with the galaxy watching. She intended to keep that promise. "Envoy," she said, "I'm going to give you access to a secure communications channel to your administrative council. You have 6 hours to contact them and recommend unconditional compliance. I suggest you explain what I have explained to you, the evidence, the warrants, the fleet, and the timeline. I suggest you use the phrase unconditional compliance. It is the only phrase that will prevent the loss of your security fleet." She pressed a control on her console. The door to the observation chamber unlocked with a soft click. "Your escort will take you to the communications suite. The channel is monitored but not content restricted. You may say whatever you wish. I recommend clarity over diplomacy." Valith stood. She was tall, a full head taller than Soren would have been if they had been in the same room. Her diplomatic whites hung on her angular frame, the lubricant stain on the hem catching the overhead light. She looked at Soren through the glass with an expression that Soren catalogued as something between full comprehension and the particular variety of despair that arrives when a person understands that the architecture they have lived inside has been taken apart around them while they were standing in it. "How long has the fleet been planned?" Valith asked. 14 months in active preparation," Soren said. "The investigation has been running for 11 years. The first colonist was taken 15 years ago, so the answer depends on where you start counting." Valith nodded once, stiff, mechanical, and turned toward the door. The marine sentries flanked her without a word. The door sealed behind them with a quiet magnetic click. Soren watched them leave. Then she turned back to her console and opened the next batch of intake records. The list was not yet complete. 4,209 names matched, 10,403 remaining. Her team was working in rotating shifts on the deck below, 16 analysts cross-referencing Kalori intake records against Terran colonial registration databases, matching biometric data, confirming identities, logging outcomes. The work was slow, meticulous, utterly necessary. Every name mattered, not as a data point in an intelligence briefing, not as a statistic in a legal filing. As a person who had been taken, classified according to their economic utility, and either worked to death or incinerated, and whose identity deserved to be recovered from the bureaucratic language that had tried to erase them. She opened the next file. Tessari 14 intake records, batch 7 of 23, 161 colonists from the Arden Valley agricultural settlement. She began cross-referencing. Entry 1. Hanna Vogt, age 39, structural engineer. Category 1, labor extraction. Assigned to Tessari 19 mineral processing facility. Death record, cardiac arrest secondary to sustained overwork under inadequate atmospheric filtration, 2313. Time from intake to death, 14 months. The file included a note from the facility supervisor, recommending that future Category 1 workers from engineering backgrounds be assigned to lighter duties to extend their productive lifespan. The recommendation had been filed. It had not been implemented. Soren logged the name, cross-referenced the biological match from the Tessari 19 recovery team samples, confirmed, added Hanna Vogt to the master list, entry 4,210. Entry 2. Kofi Asant, age 57, agricultural specialist, Category 1, labor extraction, assigned to Tessari 22 excavation site. Death record, structural collapse during unsupported tunnel excavation, 2314. Time from intake to death, 9 months. The tunnel he had been working in had been flagged 3 times by the facility's own structural assessment system as exceeding safe depth without reinforcement. The assessments had been filed. The tunnel had not been reinforced. Logged confirmed, 4,211. At 3:40 station time, her console chimed with an incoming priority communication from Vice Admiral Oduya aboard the flagship Atonement. She opened the channel. Commander Soren, Task Force Ledger is 9 hours from first contact. All task groups are on schedule and in formation positions. Kalori patrol vessel locations confirmed. 37 of their 40 vessels currently in standard patrol patterns across the cluster. 3 docked at Kalar Prime Orbital Station. Interdiction positions on all 40 will be established within the first 12 minutes of the operation. Acknowledged, Admiral. The envoy has been briefed and provided access to the secure communications channel. No response from the Administrative Council yet. Expected, they will deliberate until the fleet is closer. They negotiate against the clock. Oduya out. Soren returned to the file. Entry 47. Marin Villiers, age 11, Tessari 14. Initial classification, Category 3. Reclassified to Category 1 at age 13. Reassigned to mineral extraction on Tessari 19. Last activity log entry dated 23/16. No death record. Soren stared at the entry for 5 seconds. No death record meant one of two things. Marin Villiers was among the survivors not yet located and recovered, or the facility on Tessari 19 had stopped maintaining complete death logs at some point, and the records were simply incomplete. The second possibility was supported by the evidence. Several of the later period facilities showed gaps in their documentation. A degradation in administrative rigor that suggested the program had expanded faster than the bureaucratic infrastructure could track. But the first possibility was also real. If Marin Villiers was alive, she would be 19 now. She had been 11 when the intake teams came for Arden Valley. She had survived the initial culling not through any act of resistance or fortune, but because the administrative system's age threshold for Category 3 elimination was set at 6. She had been 5 years past it, old enough, in the eyes of a utility classification algorithm, to be worth the cost of feeding until she could be put to work at 13. Soren flagged the name for the recovery teams with a priority marker and a note. Possible survivor, Tessari 19, verify status before facility seizure. Then she moved to the next entry. Entry 48. Rael Peterson, age 63, retired mining foreman. Tessari 14, Category 3. Thermal reclamation 2311, 72 hours after intake. Rael Peterson had survived 40 years in Terran deep space mining operations, had retired to the Arden Valley settlement to grow vegetables in the agricultural dome, and had been classified as economically unfit by an algorithm that measured human worth in units of extractable labor. He had been 63. The threshold for Category 3 was 60. 3 years past the line. Logged confirmed, 4,241. Entry 49. Lena Peterson, age 61. Same surname, same intake date, same Category 3 classification, same thermal reclamation date, same 72-hour processing window. Rael Peterson's wife, Soren confirmed from the Colonial Registration Database. They had been taken together and killed together. Their biological match data, recovered from the same thermal reclamation chamber, showed calcium phosphate signatures consistent with simultaneous processing. Logged confirmed, 4,242. This was the work, not the fleet, though the fleet was essential, not the confrontation with the envoy, though that served its purpose. The work was this: the names, every name recovered, every identity confirmed, every person accounted for as a human being who had existed, been taken, and who deserved to be found. And sometimes the work was finding that a husband and wife had been burned together, and logging both of their names and moving to the next entry because there were 10,000 more. At 6:15, the first response arrived from the Kalori Administrative Council via the monitored communications channel. Soren read it in the original Kalori, parsed the diplomatic structures, then read the automated translation to confirm nuance. The response was 7 paragraphs of formal institutional language that reduced to 3 operative words: conditional partial compliance. The Council would permit Terran access to 12 of the 23 facilities, specifically the 12 that Soren's team had already infiltrated, and that the Council presumably knew were compromised. The remaining 11 would be subject to diplomatic negotiation through the Interspecies Arbitration Council, a process that, based on historical precedent, would take between 3 and 7 years. The arrest warrants were formally rejected as extraterritorial overreach, in violation of the trade authority's sovereign administrative jurisdiction. The scheduled evidentiary release was characterized as a hostile act that would be met with formal complaints to every relevant interstellar body, and an immediate suspension of all trade agreements with Terran commercial interests. Soren read the response once more. She had not misunderstood any of the diplomatic language. It was exactly what she had expected. The Council was still operating within the framework of interstellar commerce and diplomacy, still calculating that the institutions of galactic governance would provide them procedural cover, still treating this as a negotiation in which they held leverage. They did not yet comprehend that the framework had already been bypassed. She forwarded the response to Vice Admiral Oduya with a single annotation: no change to operational timeline or parameters. Then she opened a channel to the communications suite. Envoy So, I have read the Council's response. It is insufficient. The operation will proceed as planned across all 23 sites without modification. I will be precise about what that means. In approximately 8 hours, every Kalori patrol vessel in the Tessari cluster will be given 15 minutes to stand down. Any vessel that does not comply will be disabled by force. All 23 facilities will be breached simultaneously by Marine assault teams. All 312 individuals named in the arrest warrants will be taken into Terran custody. The full evidentiary archive will be released on the automated schedule. Nothing in the Council's response changes any component of this. Valith's voice came through the channel, stripped completely of diplomatic varnish. Commander, the Council will not comply unconditionally. They believe this is a negotiation. They believe the threat of trade suspension provides meaningful leverage. It does not, Soren said. The trade relationship between your authority and Terran commercial interests generates approximately 400 billion credits annually. Task Force Ledger costs approximately 12 billion credits to deploy for this operation. The trade relationship is a footnote. Convey that arithmetic to your Council in whatever language you believe will be most effective. You have 7 hours remaining. She closed the channel. Before returning to the list, she checked the operational status board. Task Force Ledger's 23 breach teams had been assigned their targets 6 months ago. Each team had rehearsed its specific facility seizure 11 times in simulation, using the floor plans and security data that Soren's undercover operatives had extracted. The simulations had been run against worst-case scenarios: armed resistance from facility security, attempted destruction of evidence, attempted harm to detainees. In every simulation, the breach teams had secured their objectives within 14 minutes. The longest clearance time in any scenario had been 22 minutes at the Tessari 9 facility, which was the largest and most heavily staffed. The real operation would go faster. The Council's unconditional compliance, when it came, would mean standing orders for facility security to stand down. But Soren had planned for the possibility that local commanders might not obey those orders, that the gap between Council directives and facility-level compliance might be measured in minutes or hours. The breach teams were prepared for both scenarios. That was the nature of the planning. Every contingency mapped, every variable accounted for, every outcome anticipated. The same methodology she had applied to the investigation for 11 years, now applied to the operation that would close it. She returned to the list. Batch 7, Entry 73. Diakor, age 44, teacher. Tessari 14, Category 1, labor extraction, assigned to Tessari 19 mineral facility. Death record, respiratory failure secondary to prolonged mineral dust exposure without adequate protective equipment, 2314. Time from intake to death, 11 months. Diakor had been a teacher. She had taught primary-level science at the Arden Valley Settlement School. The intake file listed her skills assessment as no extractable technical value, reassigned to general labor. 11 months later, her lungs had filled with mineral dust. Soren logged the name. Cross-referenced the biological match. Confirmed. Added Diakor to the master list. Entry 4263. Entry 74. Thomas Brandt, age 52, structural engineer. Tessari 14, Category 1. Assigned to Tessari 22. Death record, structural collapse during unsupported excavation, 2315. The same kind of unsupported tunnel that had killed Kofi Asant a year earlier at the same facility. The structural assessment flags had been filed. The tunnels had not been reinforced. The pattern was consistent across every facility Soren's team had examined. Safety reports filed meticulously, safety improvements never implemented. The documentation existed. The action did not. Logged confirmed, 4264. At 800, Soren's deputy, Lieutenant Commander Ezra Holt, came up from the analyst deck with a status update and 2 cups of coffee. Holt was 40, methodical, and had been with the expanded team since its first month. He set 1 cup on Soren's desk without being asked, which was the kind of small operational awareness that had made him indispensable over 3 years of classified work. "We're through Batch 4 on Tessari 7 and Batch 6 on Tessari 11, he said. "Running total is 4,412 confirmed matches. Recovery teams on Tessari 19 have flagged 3 additional possible survivors based on activity log gaps. I've routed the names to Oduya's advanced team for priority extraction during the facility seizure." "What about the non-Terran populations?" "Batch processing has started on the Drenari intake records from Tessari 16 and 23. Early indications suggest approximately 6,000 Drenari nationals were processed through those 2 facilities between 2314 and 2318. We have no colonial registration database for the Drenari, so we are relying on biological sampling and the Kalori's own biometric intake scans for identification. The Drenari government has been contacted through back channels they did not know. Their diplomatic response is still being formulated, but the preliminary intelligence suggests they believe their missing populations had been lost to a series of natural disasters that the Kalori reported in the relevant systems. Holt paused. The natural disaster reports were filed by the same Kalori administrative office that filed the Terran voluntary relocation reports. "Same methodology," Soren said. "Different cover story, same outcome." "Yes, Commander." She took a sip of the coffee. It was terrible. Station coffee always was. She drank it anyway and turned back to the console. The hours passed. The list grew. Name by name, entry by entry, the same patient process that had begun 12 years ago with a single number that did not match. Soren's team worked in shifts on the deck below. Status updates arrived from Vice Admiral Oduya at regular intervals. 7 hours to contact, 6, 5, 4. The fleet moved through the dark, 138 ships maintaining formation in a transit corridor that the Kalori did not know existed, because Soren had identified the gap in their sensor coverage network 3 years ago and had filed it under operational advantages, not to be disclosed until deployment. At 11:30 station time, the second response came from the Kalori Administrative Council. Soren opened it immediately. 3 paragraphs. The diplomatic formalities were gone. The institutional language was stripped to plain speech. Unconditional compliance. Full access to all 23 facilities without restriction. The security fleet would stand down upon contact with Task Force Ledger. All 312 named personnel would be surrendered to Terran custody without resistance. The Council's only request was that the evidentiary release be delayed by 72 hours to allow the authority to prepare a coordinated public statement. Soren read the response twice. The delay request was predictable. 72 hours to prepare a public statement meant 72 hours to coordinate a narrative, to frame the program in language designed to minimize political damage, to position the authority as a cooperative partner in the resolution of an unfortunate administrative irregularity. Soren had anticipated this request and had made her decision about it months ago. The archive would be released on the original schedule, without delay, without negotiation, and without the authority's interpretive framework attached to it. The raw data would speak in the language of intake records and thermal reclamation logs and bone calcium matches, and the galaxy would read that language and draw its own conclusions. The authority would get no head start on the narrative. The dead would speak first. She forwarded the response to Vice Admiral Oduya with a single annotation: compliance confirmed. No modifications to any operational parameter. No delay to evidentiary release. Archive goes out on schedule. The dead speak first. She leaned back in her chair for the first time in 16 hours and allowed herself 30 seconds of stillness. Through the reinforced viewport to her left, the stars held their positions. Cold, indifferent, ancient. Somewhere in that dark, between those unchanging points of light, 138 warships were closing the final distance. In 5 hours, they would arrive at the first facility. 9,000 Marines would breach 23 sites on 17 worlds across the Tessari cluster, in a coordinated operation timed to the second. 312 Kalori officials would be removed from their posts, restrained, and transported to the Judicial Station Meridian, which had been fitted out for exactly this purpose, and named for the colony on Tessari 3 where all of it had begun. And in 72 hours, the entire galaxy would read the list. Soren's 30 seconds ended. She leaned forward and opened the next file. Tessari 14, Batch 7, Entry 75. She had 10,000 names left to match, and she was going to match every single one. Not because anyone had ordered her to finish before the operation. The legal threshold had been exceeded months ago. The warrants were issued. The fleet was moving. The evidentiary case was proven beyond any standard that any tribunal in the recognized galaxy could demand. The list did not need to be complete for the mission to succeed. She completed it because the names were people. Because Asham Morno had been 3 years old and had never learned to read, and had been classified as Category 3, economically unfit, and had been incinerated in a thermal reclamation chamber within 72 hours of arriving at a place described in official records as a settlement. Because Dr. Emerick Zhao had been studying alien moss and had published 41 papers and had been 78 years old and had been burned, because an algorithm had calculated that a 78-year-old xenobotanist could not generate enough labor value to justify the caloric cost of feeding him. Because Diacor had taught children science and had breathed mineral dust for 11 months in a tunnel where she never should have been. Because Marin Villiers had been 11 years old when someone had decided she was too young to work and almost young enough to burn. And 2 years later someone else had decided she was old enough after all, and she had been handed a drilling tool and sent underground. Because the Kalori had documented every step of it with the meticulous precision of a civilization that believed in the sanctity of administrative records, and someone had to read every word of that documentation and convert it back from serial numbers and category codes into names. And Nea Soren had decided 12 years ago, on a Tuesday afternoon, that the someone would be her. Entry 75. Yuki Tanaka, age 26, communications technician. Tessari 14, Category 1, assigned to Tessari 9 heavy construction. Death record, blunt force trauma during structural assembly, 2312. Logged confirmed, 4,312. Entry 76. Anders Roth, age 33, hydroponics engineer. Tessari 14, Category 1, labor extraction, assigned to Tessari 31, agricultural processing. Death record, heatstroke during outdoor construction, 2313. The environmental conditions report for that day at the Tessari 31 facility recorded an ambient temperature of 57 degrees Celsius. The caloric work schedule for that day had not been modified. The shift had been the standard 12-hour rotation. Anders Roth had collapsed at hour 9. The facility medical log recorded his death as exposure-related and recommended the installation of cooling stations at outdoor work sites. The recommendation had been filed in triplicate. No cooling stations had been installed at Tessari 31 or any other facility. Logged confirmed, 4,313. She moved to the next name. On the deck below, the 16 analysts worked. In the medical ward, the 47 survivors rested under Terran care, some of them sleeping without the sound of machinery for the first time in years. In the communications suite, Envoy Valith so sat in silence, having transmitted the word that would open every door her authority had ever sealed. She had served the trade authority for 31 years. She had negotiated transit agreements and resource allocations and labor compacts across dozens of systems. She had believed, with the particular certainty of a career diplomat, that the institutional frameworks of interstellar commerce were the architecture of civilization itself, that they held because they worked, that they endured because they were necessary. And now she understood, in the cold and final way that understanding arrives when there is nothing left to misunderstand, that a single human analyst with a census discrepancy and 12 years of patience had used those same institutional frameworks, the filing systems and the documentation protocols, and the administrative records that the authority had treated as the infrastructure of impunity, to dismantle the authority's machinery from the inside out. The irony was not lost on her. The Kalori had believed that their meticulous documentation made them professional. Soren had recognized that it made them accountable. In the transit corridor, Task Force Ledger moved through the dark. 138 warships, 9,000 Marines, 5 hours to contact. And in the intelligence station where all of it had been conceived, designed, built, and set into motion, Commander Nea Soren sat at her console and added names to the list. One at a time, each one confirmed, each one a person recovered from the administrative language that had tried to reduce them to a utility classification and a disposal date. The fleet was the instrument, the warrants were the authority, the archive was the evidence. The list was the promise. And Commander Soren kept her promises.